The new Titan exotic Hazardous Propulsion is so much fun. It shoots mini rockets from your body and then buffs your rocket launcher for things like this. Imagine dealing nearly 1,000,000 damage before even starting a full DPS rotation. I went pretty deep on testing for this exotic and discovered a lot, so here's what you're going to learn today. How the exotic works, some cool weapon synergies and damage stacking, like how to make your rocket launcher deal over 3 times more, some pros and cons, do's and don'ts, and even a few bugs I think Bungie needs to fix. And then I've added a bonus prismatic build that's an absolute blast to use with it. So how does it work? Well, getting precision hits or final blows with the weapon, a bar on the left-hand side called Exodus rockets will slowly get filled up to 6 stacks. This will mean 2 things for you. The first is how many rockets you'll shoot whenever you use your class ability, so the barricade or a thruster. And the second is how much damage it's going to buff your rocket launcher weapon. So for instance, if I shoot 1 rocket, it does some damage and then gives me a 10-second window for me to do extra damage on my rocket launcher. Because that stack was only 1, my rocket's going to get a 10% damage buff. If I shoot 6 rockets, however, not only are you cranking out way more Exodus damage from the exotic, but now your rocket is going to be buffed by 35%. I've put up a table on screen to show you the escalating damage stacks from 1 to 6, and the beauty here is that this will stack with many other buffs, allowing you to get it way higher. We're going to cover that in the next section, but basically with this exotic, you get to just go around playing any activity you want, just as usual, and then every time you use your class ability, you're either wiping out a bunch of adds or taking out a solid chunk on a tougher enemy and then get to deal way more damage with your heavy. They even track around corners too, like these are no pea shooter. They add to your gameplay a lot. So let's move on to the damage stacking and weapon synergies. During all of my testing, I started to find these unique, cool weapon interactions that I want to show you, and then I managed to get my Apex Predator rocket to deal over 3 times the amount of its original base. So let's start with that. Pretty simple, the first buff is your actual exotic. Once you pop your Exodus, it's going to give you a 35% buff to your next rocket. But then I thought to myself, well, a lot of people run surges in this, so if I have 3 of those, that's another 22%. And then I realized a really popular perk on rocket launchers is bait and switch right now. Well, that's another 30% buff, and it stacks. For a while, this is what I was doing, and then throughout my gameplay, I realized that whenever you pop Transcendence, that adds another 5% to all of your weapons, so stack that on top. And then I noticed I was doing way more damage when I was playing with some of my buddies because they're hunters and they like to spam their tether all of the time. That's what you call a debuff on enemies, which in this case is another 30% to the weapon. But then, when I was playing with a buddy using Gallarhorn, I realized that it gave the Wolfpack rounds to my rocket, obviously, and those got buffed by the Exodus. So basically, I ended up coming back after a lot of my gameplay and doing some testing on Callus, and while I'm not here to claim some crazy top 0.1% DPS strat or anything, my point is that it's just really fun and can add a lot of damage while you're at it. You also don't even need teammates, by the way. Like, yes, a tether or a tractor cannon, even divinity, those are all great for debuffing, but you can apply them yourself too. I mean, the new Void Super on Titan, that for example can apply a debuff, and you can use that with this exotic. Another cool thing that my friend mentioned was that he always gets left with the Gallarhorn roll. Like, usually a DPS group wants 1 Gallarhorn in order to make everyone else's rockets better, right? The reason some people don't like that is because the Gallarhorn itself doesn't deal that much damage, but if that person is running the Exodus exotic, now they can actually make up for that lost damage themselves and add to the team. This also applies to the divinity, by the way. I mentioned that divinity can debuff an enemy. That's the one that puts up that big blue crit. Well, because you're hitting non-stop crits while you're applying your divinity, you can quickly re-proc the Exodus stacks. Like, you'll get back from 0 to 6 super quickly. This applies to your teammates too, because they're all hitting crits. So just imagine like 6 Titans shooting 36 Exodus rockets at the start of a DPS phase, then re-getting their Exodus stacks again really quickly and doing it again. I think it'd just be hilarious. Now, I did find one major bug when I was doing all of these tests, but that's part of the next section, and I want to mention a couple other weapon synergies before we get there. Because the description on this exotic says it increases the damage you deal with all other rockets, it doesn't just apply to a rocket launcher. Like, of course, that's the first instinct, but other weapons have rocket interactions too, like the Grand Overture. That thing is sweet because I find a lot of people kind of hang on to their rocket launcher for some reason when they're playing. Like, they don't use it that much because they want to save it for a DPS, right? But when you're using a non-rocket launcher, you can kind of use it freely and just destroy everything in your path. This thing's really good at that because shooting it over and over builds up the volley chamber, and then you spit out 20 rockets that are all getting a 35% buff. It can absolutely decimate things, and I found myself using it a lot. Another unique interaction was the Quicksilver Storm. For anyone who hasn't used it, it shoots these little tracking rockets just basically for scoring hits, so whenever you're playing, it just starts to shoot these things at these enemies. Well, those also get the buff. And then a third one that I found was rocket pistols. They get buffed too. Just imagine your favorite rocket pistol getting a random 35% buff for a full 10 or 11 seconds after every time you use your class ability. I'm in love with these things, and I'm still finding more things that get buffed the more I play, but let's just move on to the next section. Some pros and cons or do's and don'ts that I learned from using it a lot, and then some things that I think are bugs that may need to be patched. For starters, one crit doesn't necessarily guarantee one stack. I remember thinking, oh, I'll just use a high rate of fire weapon and that way I'll get my stacks like instantly, but that's not actually how it works. I can hit Carl here with a 900 RPM weapon and it takes quite a few bullets to get another stack added, whereas a low rate of fire weapon, like an Igneous Hammer 120 RPM, can actually do it in 1 or 2 shots fairly consistently. This is because precision hits or final blows give you a chance to load an Exodus rocket, and Bungie seems to have manipulated the odds of getting it based on the weapon you're using. Maybe not weapon, but like RPM and damage amount, right? And this is really cool because it means you can use any weapon you want and you're relatively the same with respect to getting your stacks up. Another little tip I guess is just remembering that final blows do it too. Like early on, I found myself focusing so much on getting crits, which of course is good. You always want to hit headshots, but just don't forget final blows progress these stacks as well. Now, a bug that I think exists is the fact that Radiant is overriding it right now. When I was having some fun testing out how much I could get my rocket to deal, stepping into a Well of Radiance, for example, overrode everything and just gave it a flat 25%. That's considered an empowering buff and should work, which could technically make this broken. So maybe it's not a bug, but I've heard some things where it's overriding other aspects of the game that it normally wouldn't. So it's very possible this is something that has to get patched. I just wanted to bring it to your attention that if you're getting Radiant very often on whatever build you're choosing, it's still great. You're going to get 25%. It's just not the full potential of a 6-stack 35%. Now, another thing I noticed is that you want to spec into your class ability a lot. Because you can get 6 stacks really often, you want to make sure that you can use them every time they come up. Another buddy of mine that was using this felt like he was always saving it for that perfect scenario, like he wanted to just wait till he got 6 stacks and then use it on a tough enemy, and that's really not what you want to do here. You just want to pop these things non-stop. So let's move on to the Prismatic build that I've made. I originally thought I should just end the video here and maybe only talk about the exotic, but I've been cooking up some insane Prismatic builds while I was using this, and I just really wanted to share it because it's some of the most fun I've ever had. The key objective within the build is being able to use your class ability as much as possible so you can spam those Exodus rockets as much as possible. Because of this, I'm going to cover the build in a bit of a cycle. Number 1, we're going to jump right into everything that feeds that objective. The fragments, mods, elemental buffs, anything that gets you your class ability quicker. Then I'm going to move on and show the subclass choices like grenade, melee, a bit of transcendence tips that I found, what super to use. There's some leftovers that I'll explain, like the rest of your toolkit that boost a lot of the build. Then ultimately some weapons that I found I really enjoyed using, and then I'll wrap things up by recommending a couple artifact choices. So, your objective, getting your class ability as much as you can. First thing you need to decide is using one of the 2 barricade types or thruster. I recommend thruster because it's the shortest cooldown of the 3 and it's just way more fun for fast gameplay. But now how do we make that way quicker? Well, the first thing you want to do is use the Facet of Hope fragment. This gives you up to 85% faster class ability charge rate, and all you gotta do is have an elemental buff. What the heck does that even mean? Well, on Arc, for example, it just means being amplified. On Solar, it would be Radiant, like each subclass has a corresponding elemental buff. You might hear people say that this fragment is 60% faster, but that's wrong, okay? It's not how it works. It's actually kind of convoluted. What it does is it takes your current charge rate speed, and then it adds 60% of the charge rate speed that a base cooldown would get on top of whatever you're currently running. It's not really worth getting into. The point is that it just comes back way sooner when you're using this. More importantly, though, is how do we get an elemental buff on our Guardian? On this build, you're going to be amplified a lot. So let's talk about that next. There's an intrinsic synergy when having an arc ability or aspect on your subclass. Literally just on your Prismatic subclass page, having something arc will allow you to proc the amplified elemental buff by simply getting arc kills. It can be an arc weapon, an arc nade, arc melee, just anything arc, and bam, you're amplified. There's more to what this buff brings to you, but I'm going to come back to that so that we can stay on track with this first section. Number 2 on cutting your cooldown a lot is the Awakening Fragment. This makes it so dealing light and dark damage spawns elemental pickups. What the heck are those? Well, they're the Ionic Traces for Arc, Fire Sprites for Solar, Void Breaches for Void. Again, just corresponding to the elemental type, they'll be an elemental drop. The really cool thing here is that it does not have to match what you're running. The pickup that spawns relates to whatever damage is dealt. So I can be on my Arc subclass here and using a Void weapon to create a Void Breach. My Solar Machine Gun will make a Fire Sprite. Even abilities count too, so my Arc Nade will create an Ionic Trace. This fragment is so incredible because you can create all 5 types of pickups on one build, and the reason it matters in this case is they give 12.5% back to your class ability. We're going to talk more about these later because they're insane, but the third method of getting your class ability back is the Utility Kickstart mod. This goes on your class item, and the way it works is that every time you use your class ability, in this case a thruster, it instantly refunds a portion back. The amount of energy that it refunds back in that little square depends on something called armor charges. Those are another buff on the left-hand side of your screen, similar to Exodus where they have these squares, whereas every time you pick up an orb, you build up these armor charges. On this build, you're often going to have 4 of them, and the way the math works out is that every time you use your thruster, you just get 40% back. All in all, with those 3 major contributors to this, it's perfect. There's technically a lot more ways you can cut your cooldown even further. Like I had it to a point where you can just almost use it over and over, but you don't need that. And so what's cool is that it opens a lot of other slots for things that you can make the build better with. So let's talk about it. Your actual subclass, what do you want to use? Well, I like to use Thunder Crash for my super, but you can use whatever you want. The Void one, for example, that one's new and shiny, so go ahead and use it. You can still become amplified even though you're on your Void super. This is why I'm loving Prismatic, because there's so many interactions like that. Now, I already mentioned that you're using Thruster, so let's move on to the Grenade. I love the Pulse Grenade. Early on, when I was kind of fine-tuning the build, I was torn between that and the Shackle because I just love suspending people on command, but the Prismatic Grenade on Titan does that too, and having an Arc Nade for this build means you're always going to be amplified. And coming back to that turn, by the way, it isn't just for your class ability charge rate that I talked about before. Like, yes, it does that with that fragment, but honestly, I just love it for the speed. You move so fast when you're amplified. You get plus 50 mobility, a way quicker sprint with 15% damage resistance, by the way. You get a way higher jump, a longer slide, and it even buffs all of your weapons. Like, the handling just skyrockets on this thing. It's a very fun run and gun style of gameplay. We end up buffing the Pulse Nade on this too, but we're going to move on to the next one, which is your melee. I go with the Void Shield Throw all the way. You technically can't go wrong here. Like, you could use whatever you want and it'd be fine. But I just love having a throwable melee that I can use from far away that also gives me an overshield on every enemy it hits. There's a lot of times where this saves me in my gameplay, so I highly recommend using it. For my 2 aspects, I use Knockout and Diamond Lance. The synergy on these is so cool. What Knockout does is 2 things. Number 1 is every time you get a melee kill, you're just going to get health immediately, which also saves you a lot, by the way. But then when you do that, you're also going to become amplified or just refresh your timer if you already were. If you break an enemy's shield, now your melee is dealing double the damage and you have more range. Like, you can just go very Titan on things, if that makes sense to you. And probably the coolest part about this is that Knockout has an intrinsic trait that makes your normal uncharged punch count as a charged one. So for instance, I'll use my shield throw for distance, but then up close, I've got my knockout punch. And because it's counting everything as charged, it will proc anything else that requires a powered melee. This brings us to our next aspect, which is Diamond Lance. And my god, I had no idea how much fun these were. Any ability kill will give you a Diamond Lance. It doesn't have to be stasis damage. Any ability, so your grenades will create them, but then also your melees, even the uncharged ones, thanks to Knockout. The sheer amount of Diamond Lances that you create on this build is so fun. You just have to remember to keep spamming your interact button to pick them up. It has an area of impact, so it can freeze a complete group of enemies. When they shatter, there's more damage that can be dealt, which can then proc other things that we're going to talk about later. And it even saves you sometimes too, like you can just completely stop something or stun them, if you will. Now with the core subclass items set, let's move on to the leftovers section because this is what juices a lot of your toolkit. Staying on the topic of those diamond lances, I run the Facet of Command fragment. Every time you free someone with those diamond lances, it buffs your weapons. You get a boost to stability, aim assist, even airborne effectiveness. But then the beauty here is that whenever you kill those frozen enemies, it spawns a stasis shard for you. What do those do? Well, they give chunks of your melee back, meaning more shield throws, meaning more overshields. The fourth fragment I use is Facet of Dominance. This one makes your arc pulse grenade jolt enemies. Pretty simple, honestly. It just sends lightning between them all, adding a ton more damage. It's awesome for groups of adds and feeds into our next set of mods. On my gauntlets, I like to run 3 in particular. The first is Momentum Transfer, which gives me melee energy from grenade damage, and it's a lot thanks to the fact that we've beefed up our grenade. Then I like to run Impact Induction, which gives me grenade energy from melee damage. These two mods cycle off each other super well, and I really want to reiterate that this build is amazing because you don't need everything pushing towards your class ability. The fact you get that back so fast from those 3 items in the first section allows you to do these types of things on your build. The third mod on your gauntlets is either Firepower or Heavy-Handed. Getting kills with your grenade or melee will generate orbs. This is great for feeding those armor charges that we spoke about earlier. You can use either one you want, they're both fine, but even though the Heavy-Handed mod says it requires a powered melee, we solved that with the knockout aspect. Now, since I mentioned orbs, let's talk about some of the mods on my boots. I run the Recuperation mod because that gives me 70 health on every orb pickup. It's excellent for tougher gameplay. The second one I run is Absolution, which means every time I pick up an orb, it'll actually recharge all 3 of my abilities, Thruster, Grenade, and Melee. This isn't crucial, and if you want to run something else, that's totally fine, but it felt like it rounded out the build cooldowns. An excellent alternative to this is Orbs of Restoration, which just fills the lowest of your 3 abilities at the time of picking up your orb. My third slot on my boots is usually for a scavenger perk just to get more ammo on whatever weapons I'm using. In this case, because I'm running Thunder Crash, which is arc, the harmonic scav will work for arc weapons. We might as well keep talking about some mods, so let's move on to the class item. I like to run Powerful Attraction. This picks up all nearby orbs every time you use your class ability. I find when I'm enjoying having quicker gameplay, this just makes it so I don't have to worry about where orbs are, and the fact you're using your class ability so often on this build, you're just picking them up all the time nonstop. It also saves you sometimes too because of that recuperation mod. You just use your class ability when you're weak and bam, you get some health. The other mod I run is Reaper. Getting a kill after using your thruster is going to create an orb. Just so many orbs. On your helmet, I really like to use the Dynamo mod. This gives you super energy every time you use your class ability. Again, because you've spec'd into having that up so often, it builds up your super way quicker. Next is a Siphon mod just to create orbs on whatever weapon that I'm using from multi-kills. And then for your third slot, you can run whatever you want really, but I like to use an ammo finder. Now the last piece of armor we'd have is your chest piece, and I've left it fairly empty on purpose. The one mod I make sure to run is Charged Up. This just bumps my armor charge limit from 3 up to 4. So because there's a lot of orbs in the gameplay, I get more bang for my buck when I use the utility Kickstart mod on my thruster. The other 2 slots, you probably want to just use resist mods for whatever activity that you're playing. That brings us to our 5th and final fragment, which is the Facet of Protection. This gives you an extra 15% damage resistance whenever you're surrounded by enemies. Honestly, use whatever fragment you want here, but I just like this if I'm running a tougher difficulty. Okay, moving on to the next section is weapons, and this will actually be pretty quick since I talked about that in the beginning. Based on everything I showed you earlier on, for the heavy slot, you definitely want either a rocket launcher or that Grand Overture exotic. They're both amazing and completely depends on whatever you're playing. One gets used a lot more throughout your gameplay and one tends to be saved a little bit for DPS. Now with that slot kind of being restricted, for the first and second slots, you can honestly use whatever you want, but what I found most fun was the new strand rocket pistol named the Call. This goes in your top slot, and there's 3 main reasons I love it so much. Number 1, I mentioned in the beginning, which is the fact it gets a 35% buff from your Exodus exotic, so you're just constantly dealing way more damage. Number 2 is that if I'm not mistaken, it circumvents the double special heavy ammo mechanic. I won't dive into this in detail because this video isn't about that, but essentially Bungie made it so that it's harder to run 2 special weapons in a heavy, but I'm pretty sure these rocket pistols did not get caught under that patch. I get a ton of heavy bricks when I'm using this and another special. Number 3 is it's just awesome. They're so fun. Now in the second slot, the energy slot, I personally love the crafted Arc Fusion iterative loop. For me, it's because it has the enhanced demolitionist perk to give me more grenade energy on kills, but honestly, anything arc here is great because of that amplified mechanic. Auto rifle, shotgun, like whatever you want, just use arc so you can get amplified more often. I did use Red Death for a while because it was a new weapon and I was excited, and I happened to notice that pulse rifles seem to be this perfect in-between. Like when it comes to that RNG on loading up your Exodus rockets, you get a lot of crits naturally and they just seem to be right in that sweet spot. Now finally, the artifact section. I nearly didn't include this because the build works great without this, but some of the choices in here really do boost things. Galvanic armor, for example, is nuts. This gives you an extra 30% damage resistance while amplified, which in this case is practically always. Another crazy one is Shield Crush. While amplified, your grenades charge faster and deal more damage. Then whenever you have an overshield, which is after throwing your Captain America shield all the time, your melee will charge faster and deal more damage. Third would be the Elemental Siphon. If I jog your memory a bit, I talked about how Facet of Awakening makes you elemental pickups for the 5 damage types, right? My Void and Solar weapons created the Void Breach and Fire Sprite. Well, having this artifact perk makes it so that kinetics do the same. And what this means is that all 6 damage types will now create those elemental pickups for you. That in itself is great, but the bonus here is this artifact perk also makes it so that whatever weapon matching your current super, in this case arc, will proc an additional elemental pickup. So in this case, every time I get my arc weapon kills, I'm gonna proc 2 ionic traces instead of 1. The last 2 I want to talk about are Press the Advantage and Radiant Orbs. The first is cool just because it gives you weapon buffs like handling, reload, stability whenever you break enemy shields. Not really that necessary, but it's cool. The second one is just to be careful with the Radiant Orbs because of what I mentioned earlier. Until that patch is fixed on why it's overriding bigger damage buffs in the game when it shouldn't be, I just wanted you to be aware of it. And with that, our cycle is complete, and I know that was a lot of information, but I wanted to make sure you understood why you're running what you are and how everything synergizes. I also paid someone to Photoshop this build summary, by the way, so that you can screenshot it and refer back to it. I've started a Patreon recently because a lot of my videos take an ungodly amount of hours to make, which results in way fewer uploads compared to everyone else in the directory. This unfortunately has been making it much harder for me to keep up financially, and I know I should just quit going so in depth on my videos and post more often, but I don't know, it's just who I am. So I just wanted to bring this up in case any of you are interested in the Patreon. Lastly, if you haven't unlocked your exotic class item yet, I made a very clear guide on how to do that, which you can watch by clicking on this thumbnail because I'm working on some of those builds next.